while the path to victory for Labor is clearer than the path to victory for the Liberals. Well, that's certainly true. I'm not going to be silly about it. There's a path to victory for the Libs. A Liberal opposition can see a path to get there with the support of independents, just as Labor needs the support of Greens.
Today's episode of Socially Democratic is now available on Patreon. Join our Socially Democratic community on Patreon for free or for as little as $2.50 a month, and you can help support the show. And when you sign up as a campaign organiser, you get access to our premium episodes, a free ticket to a live show, and our Haters Hate and the Rest Vote Labor merch. And we want to thank our latest member of Patreon, Patrick. Thank you very much for joining our Patreon community. And if you've signed up, please check your inbox for a message from our producer who's asking you for your shipping address. We need to get your address so we can send the merch to you. So please check your email. You will have received an email from us. To join all of these wonderful comrades, click on the link in the show's bio and sign up to Patreon today. Today's episode is also presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We only work with people that want to build power to make the world a better place, including community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses and social democratic parties across the globe. And we train engagement staff and volunteers in the Marshall-Gantz framework of leadership organising action. And if you want to create change in your community in 2024, then hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. They believe the law should serve everyone, not just those who can afford it. Maurice Blackburn has been fighting for workers' rights in Australia for more than 100 years, and they've helped more than 500,000 people get the compensation they deserve. And if you've been injured at work or on the road, you may have a claim through your superannuation. So for expert and empathetic legal support, call Maurice Blackburn Lawyers today. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left organising podcast that is out every Friday that dives into the campaigns of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And we are entering into campaign season. And to kick it off, we've got the ACT elections in 2 weeks' time. And today we're going to preview that election with a good friend of mine, Michael Cooney. So check that out. And if you like the show, please give us a great review on Apple Podcast and make sure you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to support us by joining Socially Democratic Patreon. And for all other things, follow Dunn Street on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. All right, enough from me. Let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a Thursday afternoon on the lands of the Wurundjeri people on a gorgeous day here in Melbourne. Spring has finally sprung in the Garden State. We're entering into what I would call election season, not just overseas, but here in Australia as well. And in a couple of weeks' time, there is the ACT or the territory election. And to help me preview this important ballot, my very special guest today has over 20 years ago was the policy director for Federal Labor in opposition speechwriter to none other than Julia Gillard when she was Prime Minister, as well as leading various think tanks and the Republican campaign there for a while. These days, he's Melbourne-based, where his day job is the General Manager for Public Affairs at Maurice Blackburn Lawyers, our sponsors. Should have got this bloke to do the reading earlier today. And his side hustle, he's the Secretary of the Celtic Club, which now has a new home at the Wild Geese in Brunswick on the corner of Sydney Road and Brunswick Road. And do yourself a favour and get along. I am a member of the Celtic Club, obviously, because I'm a cliche. You should join too. He's a native Canberran, former Chief of Staff to the then ACT Planning and Education Minister, now the ACT Chief Minister, Andrew Barr. Michael Cooney, welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thank you for having me, Stephen.
You're not the first Michael Cooney to be on Socially Democratic. How does it feel to follow your son?
I'm definitely Michael's father now that we're in Melbourne. He used to be Michael's son, and now I'm clearly Michael's father.
I know that he came in for a bit of criticism because when he did the episode, like his washing was on the bed behind him on an unmade bed, and like I think his bike was sort of sitting there. I don't
I'm
know.
cool with it. We've protected him from any of that Jordan Peterson stuff about tidy up your room. Like, he's got a very healthy masculinity, and we're good with it.
Right. Anyway, so you're bringing your A game today with your background, so I appreciate that. Maybe you're setting a norm for your son to follow if he ever comes back on the show again. Let's get into it. ACT elections. You're our expert. You basically are a walking tourism bureau for the ACT and have been for a very, very long time, as long as I've known you.
Unpaid brand ambassador, #CBR.
Yeah.
Yes, out and proud.
CBR. That's right. So let's start with the state of the race for folks that aren't tuned in to the ACT elections. The campaign officially kicked off on Friday, the 30th of September. Election day is on the October 19, so a couple of Saturdays away. Pre-poll opens this coming Tuesday. The incumbent Labor Greens coalition government, led by Chief Minister Andrew Barr, is going for Labor's 7th term, which is a long tenure against the Tories, which is led by Elizabeth Lee, who's seeking to form government for the first time in 23 years. She's also the first Asian Australian leader of any state or territory opposition. Interesting fact. There are 25 seats in the Legislative Assembly. The magic number to form government in your own right is 13. And we're going to unpack a whole bunch of these seats later. But before we do that, Michael, maybe you can just give us a bit of an overview of the politics and the demographics of the Australian Capital Territory and its uniqueness in our democracy.
Delighted to. This is my special subject if I ever go on Mastermind. So Canberra, the ACT is a governing system which combines the state responsibilities of health and education, infrastructure and so on, with local government responsibilities of parks and playgrounds and rubbish and local government stuff, all those things. So it is a city of, these days, more than 400,000 people. The territory itself does extend outside Canberra, and there are some villages in the ACT, but essentially you're talking about the politics of a big inland city, which combines local and federal, local and state issues. It's a suburban city. It's a affluent city, but with a relatively compressed income spectrum. Like, it's not a place of extremes of inequality at the top end, basically. And it is still a very public sector centric economy. Public sector demand in the economy in the ACT is pretty similar to what it's always been, although in the nature of the way government has changed in the way it's delivered over the last 30 years, a lot more people work to government from the private sector than when I was growing up in Canberra. But federal and territory government are still these big employers, as are the major universities in the city. So it's still very much, it's changed a lot, but it remains a city that's this sort of relatively quiet, suburban, white collar, relatively affluent, and in its physical layout, dispersed place to live. Yeah, and it's beautiful.
Is it a generalisation to suggest that, like other cities that are the capital of a nation, but is not the big city? And I think the obvious one is Washington DC. Washington is a Democrat town, and could you draw a parallel to the politics and the demographics of Washington DC to that of Canberra, that it inherently should be a Labor town?
I think there's a lot in that. It's certainly, if you think about the demographics of a city that's going to be public sector, it's going to coincide with a lot of the demographics that are going to be predictors of Labor voting. But with traditionally a big exception, unlike DC, unlike other strong Labor voting parts of Australia, Canberra hasn't been very ethnically diverse until relatively recently. It is a much more diverse city than it was, but it remains a relatively white place, crudely put, particularly in some of the more established parts of the town. And that's certainly very unlike DC. But in other respects, yeah, it's that sort of mix of public sector employment, first in family university education, relatively unionised out through the public sector context, universities as employers too, complex health systems as employers. Yeah, it's not a place with a traditional industrial base, but on the other hand, it's certainly a place with all the other, and it's not a place of a high level of non-English speaking background or new settlers to Australia relative to safe labour seats in the country. But yeah, like, I don't know, presumably Brasilia and Ottawa are rather similar in this respect too. Yeah.
Pretoria.
I know little about the politics of Pretoria.
So let's dive into these electorates and give us a bit of a sense of the diversity, or maybe in some cases the lack of diversity. There are 5 electorates, and I want to start with, let's go in, am I going to do this in alphabetical order? Yes, I am. Brindabella. Let's start with Brindabella.
Brindabella. So yeah, there are 5 electorates in the city. They each have 5 members for them in this multi-member system. So they're all basically the same size. They've got about 60,000 voters. With that said, they're all electorates that it would take you, 20 minutes or something to drive across. Like, they're relatively suburban electorates for that size. So Brindabella is the southernmost seat in the ACT. It includes the national park and right down to the borders of the territory. But it's the southern districts of Lanyon and Tuggeranong. By Canberra standards, a bit more tech qualified, a bit less tertiary qualified. It includes some of the parts of Canberra that are mortgage built, outer suburban, kind of large houses, heavily mortgaged families, and a little more liberal leaning, and in parts a little older, I suppose.
Next on the list, Ginninderra, if I pronounced that one right.
Ginninderra.
Ginninderra's
at the top end of the city in the north and west. So it's the suburbs of Belconnen. If anyone's ever been to Canberra Stadium or to the Canberra Labor Club, you've been in the seat of Ginninderra. And Ginninderra is the other kind of outer suburban electorate in a sense. Ginninderra is, however, unlike Brindabella, sort of a safer labour area traditionally, particularly the western parts of Belconnen. That's outer suburban, but by Canberra standards, and all these things are, Canberra's a relatively demographically flat city, but within the context of Canberra's distribution, West Belconnen's got like a relatively high level of public housing and a relatively higher level of people living with disadvantage. So it's by Canberra standards a relatively lower income seat.
Then moving across to Kurrajong.
Kurrajong contains the Hotel Kurrajong, where Ben Chifley spent his last night on Earth. So Kurrajong's the seat north and south of Lake Billy Griffin. So if you've seen Canberra on a postcard, that's probably been Kurrajong. It's old Canberra, man. So on the south of the lake, it's old Canberra. It's big, like, it's beautiful, big lawns, lots of trees. They change colours, and it's that part, what in Canberra is referred to as the inner south. That'd be the hardest part of the city for Labor, and the area where the Liberals really, and to a degree the Greens, are strongest. It's Manuka Oval would be the dark heart of NIMBY darkness, basically, and it's and it also includes the most established, traditionally advantaged areas of the city around Red Hill and up on the slopes of Red Hill, looking down on the lake. On the north side of the lake, however, it's changed a lot in the last 20 years. So that includes the city centre civic, which it says something about the social democratic character of the place, that we don't actually have a central business district. That's a bit beneath us, right? We call it civic. Thank you. And then through to Braddon, where that is by Canberra standards where your laneway bars and young renters are. But it rapidly turns back into leafy suburbia through the rest of the inner north. So it's the most difficult part of the city, and unusually last time, I know we'll do seat by seat in the full political sense, but it's the only 5-seat electorate in a Hare-Clark system to have generated 2 Greens at any election in Australia, either in the ACT or Tasmania.
I think I know the answer to this, but I'm interested to get your thoughts. Why is it this particular part of the electorate do the Greens and the Liberals do well, but Labor struggles somewhat?
Yeah, it's so having said that, Labor got 2, the Greens got 2, and the Liberals got 1 last time, so it's still relatively larger. But it's the area that's oldest, whitest, but also most associated with old Canberra. I remember listening to your conversation with the Chief Minister earlier this year, and a nice discussion there about kind of old and new Canberra and the generational divide almost in the city. And yeah, the inner south in particular, and to a degree parts of the inner north, of like, they don't want Canberra to change because it was pretty perfect for them. And in a certain sense, I don't blame them. Like if I lived in one of those little AV Jennings patches, that are 15 minutes walk from the CBD and all the rest of it, like, and you're sitting on that, you're in heaven. And why do you want land tax reform? Heavily retirees, and it's just self-funded retirees and people who could do it better themselves a bit, I think.
Second last, Murrumbidgee.
Murrumbidgee, my home patch, so Western Creek, Woden, and the Molonglo Valley. It's a very curious electorate, really. So it's the sort of southwest of the city, so north of Tuggeranong and Brindabella, like we just discussed, and south of Currajong that we were just talking about. There's a pretty good chance if you're a staffer, you've basically never been to Murrumbidgee. But it includes Western Creek, which is not as high income as the inner south, but is like 1970s suburbia heaven, basically. Like it's, I don't know what the equivalent is in Melbourne, Bundoora or something like this. It's cul-de-sacs and gum trees and crescents and setbacks and soft curbs and the whole bit. Swooping magpies and everything. But following the 2003 bushfires, which cleared out a lot of plantation forest west of the city that's actually very close in, we sort of identified an opportunity in the city to develop that valley. So that is basically between Belconnen and Western Creek, quite over the western side of the Arboretum, and it's a very new style place. So it is full of townhouses and even apartment blocks and all these things that Canberra really has never had. And there are right now like nearly 30,000 people living there, and it's growing fast. And you're out there, and it is new Canberra par excellence, right? So it's like a Woolworths metro, right? And it's, but also a far more ethnically diverse part of Canberra, and really and a lot of people who are newly settling into Canberra and into the ACT, and their experience is having bought relative to say Sydney or Melbourne, relatively affordable, relatively high quality housing in this exceptional natural environment, and they're pretty happy out there.
And so obviously I'm assuming that Murrumbidgee, that is the growth area population-wise of the ACT.
Yeah, it's like an actual new housing, like a really large new housing estate. So it's most unusual because it is like that, right? So it is like they are cutting new roads and stuff, and there's vacant blocks where a new childcare centre is going to go up and stuff like that. But it's closer to the city than most other parts of Canberra. It's very unusual to have like a really large development like that, which is so close to the centre of an urban development. Because Canberra's kind of from north to south, it's kind of wasted, and in the middle where the lake is, there's not many people east and west of that. So they're kind of coming and plugging into the middle there. There is still growth to the north of the city. Gungahlin, which we'll come to last, just to the north of the city, has continued to grow. But really, other than in Molonglo Valley, now where the space is for the ACT to grow is either infill or really in what are peri-urban areas outside the territory. So in the federal seat of Monero, either in the Yass Valley or on the eastern side of the territory in Queanbeyan and south of Queanbeyan.
Yeah, right.
So from the point of view of the actual ACT, the only real growth is going to be in Molonglo and then infill.
Let's talk about that, the very last electorate on the list, Yarrabee.
Yarrabee is basically Gungahlin. So it used to be the future, like they said about Tony Blair. Yarrabee Gungahlin is sort of now a finished new development area. It has more townhouses and a bit more density than the kind of the really old 70s Canberra. And it is also got a lot of people who've settled in Canberra for the first time and or settled in Australia for the first time, and it is certainly more diverse than old Canberra was. But it is now sort of a settled place. It's not really being done. It was at the centre of politics in the ACT for the last 10 years because of the light rail project, which linked Gungahlin at the centre of Yerrabee into the city. And with that project now done and the debate moving on to where it goes next, in many ways, Gungahlin's kind of faded from that kind of prominence it had in territory politics.
Yeah, right. Okay, so there you go, troops. You got an overview of the demographics and the electorates of the Australian Capital Territory. I wanted to now talk to you, Michael, about walking into this campaign, how Labor folks would be feeling on the ground. If I can give some context to what I'm thinking about the way that elections have been going in this sort of post-COVID era, and I define post-COVID as I define the COVID era essentially March 2020 to December 2021. So when the Hogmanay on the 31st of December 2021, bells ring, and then that's it. We're done. We're opened up, and we're all good into 2022. So since then, March 2022, we have the South Australian state election. The incumbent Liberal government loses, and Labor returns to the government benches. A couple of months later, in May of that same year, 2022, the federal election is held. The incumbent Liberal coalition government loses. Labor is turned to the government benches. In November of that year, the Victorian election is held. The highly unpopular Daniel Andrews was expected to lose. Yes, the dictator that is Daniel Andrews is expected to lose. However, Labor holds and is returned with an increased majority to the government benches. The next year, March 2023, we have the New South Wales state election, in which the Liberal government loses and Labor returns to the government benches. In a year later, in March 2024, we have the Tasmanian election, where the Liberals in government hold. And then August this year, we have the Northern Territory elections, where the Labor incumbent government loses. The CLP's return for the first time in a number of years. And now we've got two elections coming up. And in this month alone, we've got the ACT in the middle of October, and at the end of this month, we've got the Queensland state election. Now, leaving aside Tasmania, and I think this shows the significance of the how good the Victorian state Labor government is, that they bucked basically a trend in which post-COVID elections, if you're the incumbent, you're going to lose. Now, going into this election, should we be worried in the ACT about Labor's prospects, or is the ACT and its political dynamics isolated from national or state-based trends, or is just Andrew Barr absolutely crushing it and it doesn't really matter? Is he? Do you know what I mean? Like, is he a Daniel Andrews in a small town? I don't know. Talk to me what you're thinking about walking into this ballot.
There's something in the idea, I think, that a politics of a certain size, a polity of a certain size. I would say the Victoria and New South Wales are bigger than this, but systems like Tassie or the ACT or South Australia, if you're the outstanding figure in that polity, you're going to be pretty hard to shift. And he's my mate, not biased, but he's the leader. I think that's, and so, God, your first challenge is to persuade people that you've got someone who's going to be better at just leading, and certainly his persona isn't that of Daniel, so, but not unlike Malinowskis or some successful Tasmanian premiers, I do think he inhabits the space, and he inhabits the role and embodies the city in a certain sense. I think they should be most concerned about people thinking they can't lose. Like seeking a seventh term, but in a city which is easily caricatured or dismissed as a Labor place, persuading people that their vote matters and that they don't have a free kick, I think is an underlying part of the challenge. I don't think that's not a big part of the public message in the election. This isn't sort of Wayne Goss saying don't cast a protest vote, but underlying it, I think, is a question about is it a permanent government, or is it actually, or does this election matter? And honestly, in the nature of Herr Clark, it turns on fine margins. And while the path to victory for Labor is clearer than the path to victory for the Liberals, like, that's certainly true. I'm not going to be silly about it. There's a path to victory for the Libs, and it doesn't require a sea change in territory sentiment or something. It requires, a Liberal opposition can see a path to get there with the support of independents, just as Labor needs the support of Greens. I don't think this Liberal Party is showing any of the chops that would make that happen. But one thing the Libs probably have in their favour is that they're underestimated.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, and I want to ask you about the Libs in a moment. Maybe we can do a bit more of a deep dive in terms of Chief Minister Andrew Barr and his leadership. What are the strengths that Andrew brings to the table in this election, and how does that fit well with the demographics that he's appealing to?
Yeah, look, I would describe Andrew Barr as an energetic reformer. He's captured the generational change in the city. Andrew's a Gen Xer in a kind of a Gen X city now.
It's our home, Michael. Why am I living in Melbourne? The forgotten generation.
I know. He's in a city which, when you think about what people do for a living there, mostly, like a degree of rationality and a degree of not only progressive in a social sense, but just a kind of an active, rational, make changes, fix problems, consider the issues intelligently and make your case. That style of politics is going to work for you in a city like that. And the past, even prior to Andrew Barr being the Chief Minister, a succession of elections have been really defined by policies that he took to them or defended at them. So, from the time of his election, he goes into the 2007 election, I'm going to say, as the Education Minister, and the election is really defined by his policies on school closures and the consolidation of the system. Subsequent elections are defined by his policies on land tax reform as Treasurer. And then, of course, once he becomes Chief Minister, of course, it's going to be defined by your approach, in that case, in 2016 on light rail, and in 2020 on COVID, where rightly, people saw him standing up. People were right to see him standing up to pressure from New South Wales, from the New South Wales Deputy Premier who lived in Queanbeyan, and from some stupid and irresponsible Canberra Press Gallery journalists who wanted to fly on planes and play golf. And what the people saw was a bloke who was trying to run the city in their interest. So I think his manner is the right manner for this generation's Canberra. Yeah.
When I interviewed him earlier in the year up in Canberra, what struck me was John Armitage, often the researcher and Labor Party sort of pollster, talks about what voters want to see in a political leader is either they're competent or they're caring. And if you can be both, then that's a magic mix that's rare in political leadership today, right? You're either seen as being incredibly competent, but not so caring, or you're very caring, but are you very competent? And the other thing to build into that, he sort of updated that after sort of observing Daniel Andrews for a number of years, is your leadership built on wanting to be respected, not liked, and therefore making decisions that may piss off 30% of the electorate, and they're loud about it, and they're on the front page of the Herald Sun or whatever, but the silent, overwhelming majority actually back you in and respect you for the decisions and not flip-flopping, because some leaders can go, I'm getting a hard time by 3AW or whatever, therefore I'm going to now change. When actually, if you'd stuck to it, you would have been fine, you moron. So what struck me the most was coming out of that interview, I was like, oh my God, you are both competent and caring. Like there is a caring factor to Andrew. He cares about the city. He cares about the people, and it's authentic. It's not bullshit, but also he's incredibly intelligent. And from that oozes competency that, look, I know what I need to do. I know what the final year of this journey looks like, and I know how to get us to that, right? With the levers of government, but also does things that, are going to piss off some groups. Old Canberra, for example, and the tram. We had a bit of a laugh about it both on and off the show, right?
Yeah.
And he does
Well,
that. And I just want to get your reflections on that. I mean, am I off the mark on that?
No, I think that's definitely right. It's interesting that that's your perspective of him from that interview. What I think is that like he's always been regarded by the electorate as the competent one. And he's certainly always seen himself and been seen as the guy who will push through and persist with a necessary reform, even if people don't like it, you know. Like this is a bloke who, when he was closing these schools, went to public meetings, and there was some anonymous dude who would turn up at these public meetings dressed as the Grim Reaper, because Andrew Barr's the Grim Reaper is going to take away your school, and also maybe because you're alive in the 80s and you remember something else about the Grim Reaper, like this wasn't great, right?
No.
And that was his formative experience in territory politics, really, as an elected official. And then you wind the clock forward and there's tax and land and tram and all the rest of it. I think what was interesting about 2020 was it gave Andrew an opportunity to show the caring bit. People didn't doubt his common sense and rationality and stick-to-itiveness. But the bit where he was able to confront, like I say, national figures and say, maybe we just put a higher value on human life than you do, and speak with some emotion about it. And I think also the context of society having changed to making it easier for him to talk about his own personal relationships and family, compared to how easy or hard that was 15 years ago. It's meant that people have seen that side of him as well. Yeah. But he's certainly not your most extroverted or empathetic Democratic politician. We tease him that the politics of COVID suited him well because he was forced to make decisions and he was told he wasn't allowed to shake anybody's hand. This suited his style, but actually, I think he showed people himself in that period of people.
It's there. It actually is there, and I know that in a podcast format like Socially Democratic, which is, you know, we do try to make it narrative based, and obviously it's a friendly space. It's not adversarial, so people can open up. But I just, I know he's an civil aviation nerd. Like he's a nerd at heart, but in that in itself is endearing, you know.
Yeah.
Do you know who's not competent? The Liberal Party. Let's talk about them for a moment.
They've got some challenges.
Wow.
Our old friends.
Yeah, I know. Just sort of go through some of the things that's happened in the last couple of weeks or months.
Yeah, so where they're at. So, the fundamental challenge the Canberra Liberals, as they call themselves, have. So the Liberal Party in the ACT, to your point about you've got to be either competent or compassionate. So you better be at least one or the other. So if you're going to have extreme and out-of-touch politics, you better at least be rated as being able to run a bath. And at the moment, they'd be scoring poorly on both, right? So fundamentally, their challenge is that their party membership and in turn increasingly their candidates just don't represent a kind of a Canberra Liberal voter, right? Like Liberals in Canberra, they're going to be teals, basically, aren't they? They're going to be moderate. They're going to be, somewhat progressive. They're going to be warm and dry, however you want to sort of, whatever picture you want to draw of that. And increasingly over the years, really, the Canberra Liberals, by contrast, have been a very conservative Liberal Party. Now, you might be able to get away with that if you can sort of persuade the people that there's a problem that needs to be solved and it's time for a strong figure or something. But instead, frankly, what they've got is Elizabeth Lee, who, people who were taught by her at uni thought she was a nice lady, but that's about that, right? And with a front bench and group of candidates who are being serially exposed as having extreme, in some cases, distasteful or worse politics on including on race and other things. So they've got a candidate who 20 years ago wrote a school textbook, which if you read, you would get the impression that Arthur Phillip arrived with the London Mission Society, not the Royal Marines, and provides a comically deficient account of imperial colonisation in Australia. He's their Shadow Attorney General. You've got another candidate who has been outed for having a pseudonymous Facebook profile, and he's got a lot of feelings about race, which he expresses under this fake name, let me tell you. Right? And they're both in Ginninderra, by the way. And then a third candidate, and then one of their MPs they've sacked, who's now become a crossbencher and will run for re-election as a so-called Family First candidate. A mate of mine was describing this situation to me and he said, I wouldn't have advised her to say the security footage was doctored. I reckon that's probably good advice in general. Like whatever the situation, like that's not going to be your best line. So she's accused of having slapped a party official, which, to be fair, we've also like who hasn't wanted to slap a party official, you know?
Oi.
But and there's other accusations circling in the background. So yeah, they are a mess, particularly in Ginninderra, which actually might, on their path to victory, as it were, would be a pretty key seat. But at the same time, they're seen as being pretty out of touch. Yeah. It's a bad combination.
It's interesting you just raised the question about the Teals. I mean, are there any sort of Teal-type candidates that are running in this race that would benefit from what's going on internally within the Liberal Party in Canberra?
There's not a kind of, so no one's running as a community independent under that sort of banner or with the support of that network. There are some, and people because of the way the ballot paper works, if you want to run as an independent, in practice you need to form an independent grouping so you can get in your own column on the paper. So independents who've got any chance have got to form some kind of network. Anyway, so there's an independent running in the Woden-based seat who is a kind of a government critic on strongly local planning-related issues, who wouldn't be seen as a naturally left or right kind of candidate, and ran last time, got sort of 7%, and might be a chance to go in some. And then there's a group branded something like Canberra Independents, who are supported by a network with Senator David Pocock, who's the independent senator for the ACT, who's kind of both an environmentalist and like who appeals to both Green voters and Teal voters, crudely speaking. Very much his own man too. But they're not supported by, and the nature of the financing system and other aspects of the city, including the fact you can't hand out votes on election day, and so you can't hand out how to vote on election day and so on, means that there's not the same capacity for the full Teal symphony of eastern Melbourne or northern and eastern Sydney.
So we haven't spoken about the Greens.
Yeah.
Tell us about what are the Greens like in Canberra compared to, say, here in Melbourne?
Yeah, look, they are different, it would be fair to say. I mean, they've got broadly good intentions, as it were. They certainly haven't been the wrecking ball we see in other places. They don't have the, post-Stalinist faction that the New South Wales Greens have got. They don't have the kind of soap opera and personality problems of the Victorian Greens, all that sort of stuff. I would say that. And their leader, Shane Rattenbury, is a pretty responsible and respected kind of, he's actually an environmentalist, amazingly enough, for a Greens Party politician.
Yep.
So they are
they're a rarity these days in the Greens.
They really are. Like the ENGO strand of Greens Party politics is much attenuated, even out of Tassie, really. So, to be fair to Shane Rattenbury, he's that kind of Green. And in personality and in some respects, closely resembles a Chief Minister, to be honest. But as they've gotten larger, that's clearly filled up a party room with people who've got more green politics. And, I think they're caught between, are they a faction in the government or are they an opposition to the government? Broadly, to be fair, they've operated as a faction in the government, is the way I would put it in our terms, They've differed from the government at times. They've differed from the cabinet at times, but they've broadly been part of a fairly stable arrangement. You've got to acknowledge that. But I wouldn't say they are a group that see the big picture. They've got a lot of roots in kind of communal politics that are about stopping a house getting built at the end of my street because there'll be too many of the wrong kind of people in it. There's plenty of that going on in Territory Greens.
It must break the brains of their Green colleagues in other states whose whole purpose in life is simply to tear down the Labor Party, but here they are in a coalition with the Labor Party governing to try and make the lives of Canberrans better.
And look, if you're a Greens voter,
Greens.
If you're a Greens voter who wants ambitious targets for climate change or ambitious investments in public transport and so on, you would be seeing the benefit of a responsible Greens Party which works with Labor. And sure, it has a role in the game theory of keeping Labor honest or whatever, but, you would see the benefit of a responsible Greens Party and what that can deliver in a city, by contrast with the irresponsibility you see in the other. I mean, don't even start me on Brisbane Greens, bloody hell. So, what you're seeing in the Territory is a bit different, yeah.
We we'll be starting our weekly Queensland election breakdown with Jackie Trad and Evan Moorhead next week. So I'm sure we'll be getting lots of opinions on the Greens, the Brisbane Greens in those ebisodes. So I'll be looking forward to that.
Thoughts and feelings, I reckon. That'll be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm here for the feelings, absolutely. So bit of a plug there for folks next week. Issues. With all the issues, Michael, tell us about the issues in the ACT that's going to shape this election.
Well, because the ACT, as special as it is in Australia, you'll be amazed to discover that cost of living is a significant issue in the ACT election. There is no doubt about that. And while the ACT is an affluent city, it's an expensive city because it's an affluent city. It's expensive. It's not a competitive supermarket market, even by Australian standards. It's not a competitive petrol market, even by Australian standards, and so on. So, it can be an expensive place to live as a retiree or a middle class family or key workers or whatever. So, I think that's critical in the campaign. Labor's said a lot about it. Energy bill rebates, doubling free preschool, which will save a family like $2,500 a year. Free Fridays on bus and light rail, which obviously saves the family budget, but also brings business and life to the public transport hubs, including the centre of the city.
Yep.
So cost of living is critical. It's an ACT election, so it always starts with proper municipal issues. And Labor did something interesting this year by launching local area plans. Like new parks, new footpaths, shopping centre access. There's a big car park here, but we can't push a trolley to the shops. That kind of really, bread and butter city level issues. They launched that stuff as far back as July, August. And that's allowed candidates partly to play a role in the development of those plans, but also then to get out on the cell and talk about some of those really bread and butter local issues. And then it's health, education, infrastructure, and housing. It shifts into a state style campaign. There's some interesting contrasts there I can go to if you like. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about that because we've got a bit of time before we jump into the actual seats and where we think the pathway to victory is for the parties. What's some of those other issues that are going to sort of play out?
A lot of housing, the government's really been defined for years by its policy to phase out stamp duty and replace it with land tax. And I know that the Chief spoke to you at length about that when he spoke to you earlier this year. The Liberals have been on the wrong side of history on this one all the way through. And it's making a difference, including to the public finances as well as making a difference to the housing market and to access. And the Territory's also in a fortunate position by, as well as working hard, they are because they are a land developer themselves and have some levers. They'll meet their targets on the National Housing Plan, and they'll have the Territory Labor will have 30,000 new homes built over the next 6 years by 2030. So that's for everyone, that's the kind of if cost of living is obviously the screaming issue of the day. I think for everyone, housing's the big anxiety, the big unanswered. We're like, how are we going to crack this nut for the next generation? And in a Territory system, because you've got planning, because you've got home, because you've got land development and so on, you've got a particular obligation to it, but also some opportunities to fix it. So there's always been a contrast there. On health, I would say it's, Labor's backing nurses and the Libs are backed by GPs, crudely. So Labor's going to strengthen its nurse-led walk-in centres, which are extremely popular, which are good for anyone who's in a hurry to get, basic care, primary care, but also are a reform that reduce the cost of the health system overall. Naturally, the Libs are backed in GPs and support the GPs because that's kind of what they do in interest group terms. But Labor, this was really how Labor spent the opening, the 5 weeks out from the campaign on those issues, plus also the new Northside Hospital, which is in the Calvary precinct in Belconnen near the stadium where you've been. So that's really the health fight. And then on education, I'd say it's Labor's on No Child Left Behind, and the Libs are on Back to Basics. Basically, so Labor's got every high schooler getting a Chromebook, expanding the Meals in Schools program. So now 8,000 students will get a free breakfast and lunch 3 days a week. Heating and cooling upgrades in the schools. A topic of deep importance to the Chief Minister's origin story of wearing the wrong jumper to school and becoming an activist as a result. Whereas what the Liberals have talked about, I'm not sure if they've got a credible policy here, but they've talked about kind of getting back to basics on reading and writing and arithmetic, and just sort of a stereotypical Conservative outlook on that. Although I must say, I'm all for what Victorian Labor and some other state governments are doing on how reading is taught. So that's health and education. And then finally, infrastructure. There's an interesting direct contrast on infrastructure. So Labor will extend the light rail project across the lake and all the way to Woden. The Liberals will abandon it once it stops. We'll have it stop at Barton, basically just go across the bridge and stop it in the Parliamentary Triangle. And they say they'll spend the money on a lakeside football stadium, which Labor says won't fit in the space they've got, will cost a bomb, and will probably, sink into the lake because it's so close to the water.
Right.
But that's a really clear contrast, that the light rail to Woden versus a lakeside stadium.
Tories love a stadium, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, I'd love Canberra to have a new stadium too, but I don't think it fits on that side. It goes to the competence thing too. Like, I think if Andrew Barr said I can put a stadium in that spot that'll make, and the numbers will add up, I think people will believe it. I think if Elizabeth Lee says here's a CGI picture of a stadium and I promise it goes there, I'm not sure anyone's really convinced.
Yeah, exactly. Let's talk about the seats. There are five, as you said before. It's Hare Clark. Don't need to go over that. If you do want to know what Hare Clark is, go back and listen to the Jack Milroy ones we did with the Tasmanian election, so we don't have to repeat ourselves. Multi-member electorates, 5 members in each electorate. Currently, as it stands, Labor has 2, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Michael, Labor's got 2 in all 5 of the electorates. The Greens have 1 in all of them except for Kurrajong, where they have 2, and therefore the Tories have 2 in all of them except for Kurrajong.
Correct.
Labor needs to pick up 3 seats to win government in their own right.
Yep.
Can you see us achieving that, Michael Cooney? And if so, where would we look out of those seats to do so, to pick up those additional seats?
I'd love us to get to 13. I think the fun scenario is that Labor gained seats off the Greens in Brindabella and in Ginninderra, so in those 2 outer seats, and is much stronger in the cabinet, like a 12-member, including bringing some new talent in as well, but as a stronger hand in negotiations with the Greens. I think 13 is a stretch. I don't think many people will be predicting Labor actually gets to a majority government. The Territories only had 1 majority government, and that was in 2004 when John Stanhope was rightly considered a bulletproof hero for his defence of the city during the bushfire crisis of January 2003. So it's a system for minorities, but Labor could be a stronger minority. So that's kind of the fun scenario.
Yep.
There's sort of a boring scenario, which is not at all unlikely, I suppose, where there's not much change. Maybe the Libs take a seat back off the Greens in Kurrajong, but not a lot else shifts.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, look, there's a scary scenario where the Greens do poorly and lose to independents in in Ginninderra, say, where there's an incumbent Liberal running for re-election as an independent. Maybe lose to an independent in Murrumbidgee, which is the Woden Western Creek area, where I was saying before there's a high-ish profile local running there. The Greens could lose to a Liberal in Brindabella. Brindabella could go back to being 3 Liberals, 2 Labor. And the Liberals could take a seat back off the Greens in Kurrajong. That was extremely close last time. And it's pretty unusual for the Greens to get 2 out of 5. In that scary scenario, the Chief needs one of those independents to get re-elected. So there's not no path to a bad result, but the most likely scenario is somewhere between fun and boring. An interesting detail, just to cover this is an interesting bit about the way it works. So in the there's not an administrator of the Australian Capital Territory or a kind of a little, lieutenant governor or something who calls someone into, Government House in some 3-bedroom flat in Braddon or something. Like that's it. What actually happens is the Assembly forms is declared elected. Then the 25 of them meet and elect, and the clerk runs a ballot for the speakership, and then the Speaker runs a ballot for the Chief Ministership. So the thing actually gets and then the Chief Minister appoints a cabinet. And obviously, in the kind of coalition context, the Chief Minister's done a deal which has been published about what that will look like. So that is an interesting bit here, that that independents and others, they don't get to do this kind of sort of somewhat Tasmanian scenario where you sort of drag your feet and go, okay, we'll let Rockcliffe form government, but, we'll keep an eye on him or whatever. Like, you've got to vote for them, and that does have an interesting effect of stabilising it. But it does mean that if Labor and the Greens are 12, say, of the 25 seats, that, it's genuinely going to be up to any other independents as to whether they want a continuation of the government or a change of government.
You didn't, or maybe I missed it, Michael, you didn't highlight any seats, any electorates where Labor would be vulnerable to dropping a member. Is there any there that...
I think that's probably right. Yeah, when you think about it, 2 out of 5, the quotas, the quotas, whatever that makes it, 33%, right? So the second quota is 33. There's not an obvious place where Labor's particularly vulnerable to losing one of its current 2 seats, I don't think. In Brindabella, the southern seat, Labor's got a retiring incumbent, but has 4 candidates running for that vacancy, as it were, and 2 of them in particular are working very hard. Louise Crossman is a friend of the show, and
Louise.
hard-working locals out there with a 3-month-old on her hip door knocking. It's always it's great to see. And she's very much a local who listens. So, we're pretty strong in that seat where we've got someone retiring. And across the board, like Ginninderra is a seat where we maybe we've got a cheeky chance of gaining a third. I don't think we're really defending our second spot there. Funnily enough, Yerraby, the central seat, maybe in a bad day or in a bad result, that might be the one. But that's where the Chief Minister runs, and so sorry, I'm talking about Currajong. Currajong's the one where the Chief Minister runs in the central part of town. It and Yerraby are both ones where Labor's probably not going to get 3 for a long time to come, but also not going to drop below 2 for a long time to come. And the real question is whether it's a Liberal or an Independent or a Green in that 5th spot.
So, I mean, that's interesting that what you've gone through there. Brindabella, the primary vote by electorate for Labor at the last election, Brindabella is our strongest performing seat. We got 40.7% of the vote.
Brindabella, we went within an ace of winning 3 seats last time. I think it was like 80 votes at the final elimination.
Yeah, right.
Ginninderra, Kevin Bottom did a good analysis of this. Like across the board, last time we averaged like 2.34 quotas or something like this, right? Which really should get you. You would expect to get a 3rd seat in one of them, and we missed it by 80 votes in Ginninderra. Sorry, we missed it by 80 votes in Brindabella down in the south, and we missed it by about 170 votes in Ginninderra in the north.
40% primary.
They're both places.
Ginninderra, 40% primary last election.
Yeah. Now,
and then, you move down the list. Then Currajong, 38% primary at the last election, so 2 points there.
Pretty solid.
Murrumbidgee, 36.1.
Yeah.
Yerraby is our smallest, 34.2%. Yeah. Tories poll 40. That's their strongest electorate. And just so I mean, to give you some sort of like if you look at
the work's there to be done, but realistically, in a multi-member 5-seat electorate in Canberra, Labor should, it's a bit like a football team that should definitely get out of the group. Labor should get 2 out of 5 in those seats. So it would be a very poor performance.
Yeah. So maybe Yerraby would be the one that we might be worried about.
But I don't think it doesn't feel like in this election there's a place where we're concerned about going backwards.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Very good.
I should say with all that, another weird thing about the ACT is I don't believe there's been a published poll on ACT politics since the last election. There certainly has not been a published poll on ACT politics this year. This is politics without polls, which is, obviously the parties are now doing research, but there is no published polling on ACT politics of any reliability, which is a remarkable fact about a city that size.
It was bizarre because when we were obviously preparing for this episode and we were looking for polling to discuss, couldn't find any, and it was like, that can't be right. But no,
right. Most governments in Australia operate under too much pressure and make a mistake as a result. Like, you wouldn't mind an occasional wake-up call if you're running the territory government for Labor into a 7th election campaign. You wouldn't mind some moments where you could tell people to straighten up and fly right.
Yeah, exactly. Your plans, are you heading up to your hometown for the election? I'm going to shame you here if you're not. It's going to look bad, but Michael, what are you doing?
I'm not sure I will be. I last time I was in my backyard and, the Victorian Premier wouldn't let me go. So that was a pest. 2016, I got to welcome the Chief Minister to the stage. Actually, that was a lot of fun. I think I had more fun than he did, and he was having fun. No, I'll definitely give him a ring after 6 o'clock on the night, but I'll probably decide on the Friday. Yeah.
Fair enough. Well, to any of our listeners,
you can't come up and hand out. They won't let you hand out. So all you're doing is bludgeon. Like there's nothing to actually do.
But you can knock doors beforehand, and
That is true.
I'm sure that there is a link on our bio for folks who want to volunteer for the Labor Party in the lead up to this election. Go knock some doors, have some conversations. It's the most effective thing that you can do to shift a vote in this time.
Yeah, no more beautiful city in which to door knock either. And it's spring in Canberra. I mean, obviously you'll need a hat and you'll need walking shoes because the doors are a fair way apart by Australian standards. Yep. But it's a great place to campaign.
It is, absolutely. Rivaled only by their autumn. Canberra's autumn is spectacular.
True, that is true.
I'm not so keen on their winters. But
you can't. It comes as a package deal, mate. Like that.
I know. Very good, Michael Cooney. Long time coming for you to come on the show. Appreciate your insights into your home territory and home city for this particular episode. We must get you back on in the future to just talk more politics.
I'll be delighted, and hello to everyone at home who's listening.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.